Was it a compensatory sense of guilt regarding the treatment of native people? A mythical model of a simpler rural life, an existence less burdened with the rapid transformation in the technological environment? Was it an identification with political and economic struggles fostered by the inequity born of the rapid expansion of industrial capitalism? The emergence of so many alternative and intentional communities, including many which had left the cities to return to land? Was it the identification with a period of availability of free land in the 19th century, a sort of frontier mentality allowing pioneers to settle or farm? Or perhaps the romance of the outlaw and the possibility of a life somehow beyond the law, and of the increasing capillary reach of governmental regulation, whether related to hygienic standards, the regulation of births, of educational norms, of the development of codes for organization of towns, and the construction of dwellings. And I think that all of these played a part. Hard to separate them sometimes, but what they shared was a type of identification with American history, or at least a type of mythology of sort of founding histories of the nation. And I want to then try and trope on what this might mean, because it interrupts usual narratives of American revolutionary culture. As Walt Oditz, who was a poem, explained, this was a distinctly American story on the one hand. Their pioneering spirit had long been fundamental to America, and they are moved in part by the same American spark which fires the foolish men at NASA, going into outer space. But if, as he put it, America began as a commune, and if exhibited here as the same expansionist spirit, why were the hippies so disturbing? As Oditz queried rhetorically of these largely white middle-class Americans, who are these freaks who insult our best American hopes with their self-ordained poverty? Dropping out was widely read as a form of laziness born of affluence, a simple refusal of productivity in favor of idleness. And in many cases, it might well have been exactly this. But such practices might also at times be understood as moments of radical disobedience, of dissidence, or of engaged withdrawals from extant work or ethics, from normative lifestyles, and from their functioning within the capitalist mode of productivity. And I'm thinking here of an argument made by an Italian theorist, Paolo Virno, who posited that such lines of flight could take on a political cast when these acts of withdrawal or subtraction or defection became coupled with the founding of new types of social and political republics, new types of collectivity, even new publics outside the regulation of state control. Virno's examples was the mass defection from the factory and move back to the land in North America in the 19th century, an exit which to Karl Marx had proposed a type of paradox or aberration with respect to capitalist social relations, because it had confounded factory owners' ability to get cheap labor, to produce a viable labor pool. So in these cases, along with the exodus from work in Italy in the 1970s, what he explained was that these pre-established modes, the modes of a worker within the capitalist system, had been deserted, people had fled, and a sort of territory unknown to the official maps had been produced. While not wanting to gloss over some of the problematic nature of these communards' identification with alterity that I introduced before, and certainly not wanting to gloss over their lack of understanding of environmental issues, I want to try and unpack their participation in this type of exodus a little further. Virno's thesis drew not only on Karl Marx, but also on a contemporary theorist from the 1970s called Albert O. Hirschman. And Hirschman had a thesis about two dominant responses to sort of dissatisfaction with either a product or service within sort of competitive capitalist system. On the one hand was voice, or what he called protesting management, a sort of direct confrontation. On the other was exit, or simply going elsewhere, a type of mode of withdrawal and refusing to participate. Like Marx, Hirschman read the exit option as distinctly American. He said, in a real sense, this type of physical flight is the American substitute for the European experience of social revolution. And like Marx again, Hirschman believed that this drive was fueled by the promise of access to land that was free for settling in America. The exit from Europe, he explained, could be reenacted within the United States by the progressive settlement of a frontier, which Frederick Jackson Turner characterized as the great escape from the bondage of the past, the sort of idea that settling was a form of liberation. And this ideology had persisted even after the closing of the frontier. The very vastness of the country, combined with easy transportation, make it far more possible for Americans than from other people to think about solving their problems by flight rather than either through resignation or by ameliorating and fighting the particular conditions in which they find themselves. So according to Hirschman's thesis then, recent voice movements, and you have to think of movements like Black Power. Black Power was a type of radical novelty because he identified American movements with this exit option. So American movements like Black Power were a novelty because they also sought a type of collective stimulation, not an individual escape from a ghetto. This is his argument that and I don't think it's entirely accurate, but he's arguing that Black Power was ultimately about the sort of individual rise up a social ladder. Anyway, so. Okay. So when Hirschman turned to address hippie culture, he recognized a different type of operation, one that had given rise to a convolution, again, in this American character of exit. And I quote, he said, in this perspective, the present-day cop-out movements, the withdrawal movements of groups like the hippies, is, on the one hand, very much in the American tradition. Once again, dissatisfaction with the surrounding social order leads to flight rather than fight, to withdrawal of the dissatisfied group, and to its setting up of a separate scene. Perhaps the reason for which these groups are felt to be un-American, he goes on, is not their act of withdrawal, but on the contrary, their demonstrative otherness, which is sensed as an attempt to influence the square society they're rejecting. He goes on, by making their exit so spectacular, by oddly combining deviance with defiance, they're actually closer to voice than was the case for their pilgrim, immigrant, or pioneer forebearers. So for Hirschman, according to Hirschman then, hippies had worked towards activating exit through protest or voice. They had the voice that took the form of this sort of spectacular performance or the creation of these very sort of theatrical images of their deviance or of their refusal. Under the appearance of withdrawal, they had in fact been sending messages that spoke the language of a perhaps more dangerous political confrontation. To many hippies, these recent protest movements had proven largely ineffective in transforming modes of governance. And so thinking about the anti-Vietnam War protests and the protests by people who consider themselves on the political left. Actually, I'll keep going here. Just want to cite come back to another reader of the communes that identified this as a sort of paradigm shift. This is Hedgepeth. He goes on, he said, their rebellion is of a new and general pattern, as different from older social revolutions as guerrilla warfare is from conventional combat. The older type, which can be considered what he calls vertical insurgency, takes place when the low-ranking discontents in society set out to secure themselves the benefits or the privileges of those that they desire and that are enjoyed only by people in higher positions. This what he's called a sort of vertical insurgency. The present pattern of rebellion, what he calls lateral insurgency, takes place when the discontents simply go off in another direction and develop their own values and counter-institutions in absolute disregard for the established system. And the shift from protest marches to guns and bombs. With the open land, we also find them questioning whether they too would be forced to turn to violence in the face of the crushing response to the state. So initially conceived then as a type of utopian experiment, open land soon operated as a battlefield, the site of literally of a sort of battle with county authorities. When in May 1971, the county came in and destroyed the structures at Morningstar, Gottlieb noted, struck a type of more ominous rhetoric. He said this was peaceful, but think how easily this could have changed. one insane act, and he swept his arm across the cluster of officials standing there. He said, sooner or later, it will no longer be a peaceful confrontation. Someday it will be worse than civil war. So opening the land then was conceived as a form of militancy very quickly, was indicated by Gottlieb again, who explained, Morningstar is a training and replacement center, a rest and recuperation area for the army of occupation in the war against the exclusive ownership of land. He reiterated and extended this theme, suggesting that the struggle with county officials over the communal use of land was already akin to a state of civil or even guerrilla warfare, the clash of two ideologies with radically unequal military strength. Likening the commune, and again, this is one of these sort of grandiose and somewhat inappropriate analogies, but likening the commune to the Viet Cong, he declared, we're an underground movement. We're going to take some heavy blows, for sure. It's not inconceivable that the county will succeed in tearing all of the buildings down on the ranch, but we're a form of guerrilla warfare, and we're going to take our losses. So actually, I'll just move through this area a bit quickly. So Morningstar, and Wheelers had quite literally, and in multiple senses, become a type of outlaw territory. Open land had quite literally been conceived by the communards themselves as a sort of outlaw area, an attempt to open territory beyond the reach and the protection of legal codes, an attempt to demarcate and declare an extraterritorial enclave in which the usual rule of law and the function of state legislature could somehow be suspended. They willingly tried to do this. As Gottlieb proposed during an interview, what we need in this country are statute-free sanctuaries because many people fall ill because of statutes. So while they sought escape from the impact of regulatory codes, refusing to abide by legal statute that they deemed oppressive, if not harmful, to their persons, these formulations raised the question also of what sort of legal protection and citizenship rights would remain. Are we faced here with something like a perverse mirror image of declaring martial law, them declaring it themselves, or of the state's ability to suspend the usual functioning of the law through declaring a state of emergency? Can we read these hippie colonies, that is, to have formulated a type of camp, in the expanded sense of the term, theorized by Giorgio Agamben, wherein the functional nexus between territory, the state, and citizenship had become unsecured, had sort of unraveled? Certainly that was their hope, to sort of complicate a too simple topology of citizen and foreigner, of inside versus outside America, and to produce a type of spatial arrangement that they insisted would be outside the usual state of the law. And so while the communards' frequent claims then to being refugees or immigrants on their own soil were largely rhetorical, voluntary, when compounded with attempts under the rubric of voluntary primitivism to willingly forego what were, in principle, rights guaranteed by international law, the right to adequate housing, the right to healthcare, the right to education, we might begin to ask here whether what we have here is a segment of the population unwittingly appealing to the right not to have rights, not to be subject to or subjects of the law, to be, and to invoke the words of philosopher Hannah Arendt, quite literally the scum of the earth. This is a sort of paradox here. Morningstar and Wheelers were treading a very fine line then between civil disobedience and a type of total disregard for the institution of the law and its enforcement, the institutions through which civility is maintained and citizens protected and represented, but also, as they acknowledged, through which dominant techniques of power and the normalizing function of the state operated to particular and often oppressive ends. Motivating these actions, as we've seen, was the belief that a propertyless relation to the land, no ownership of the land, would lead to a distinct form of social organization, which they claimed to be tribalism, and new geopolitical relations, what they called open earth. But we need to ask, of course, how such a self-organizing system could ensure that what would come to replace the governmental rationality and its attendant institutions would be equitable, non-hierarchical, or even non-violent relations and systems of organization. What sort of political space, then, I'm trying to ask, were they actually imagining? What sort of prospects for political participation remained? How could these new communities possibly escape a situation in which other structures of power rushed in to fill that vacuum? Such a dynamic was all too familiar from the many charismatic figures within the counterculture who emerged very quickly to fill the void left by the eradication of normative social and political structures, or of the often remarked persistence of entirely hierarchical, stereotyped gender relations to which were frequently attributed natural differences between the sexes. And so I have a quick conclusion here to make, before we open this up. So what I've been trying to trace here is the manner in which the sort of forms of life practiced by these open land communes worked with quite a lot of precision upon the key components of what Michel Foucault theorized at the same time in the 1970s as the biopolitical regulation of the population. So rejecting these sorts of normative and scientifically justified approaches to health, to housing, to education, to birth rates, to labor, to the organization of the environments, they were not fighting for equitable inclusion within the system. Quite the opposite. They are trying to actively withdraw from those institutions and practices through which, micro-political techniques of power had developed within a modern form of governmental rationality. They were trying to withdraw quite precisely from the logics that the sort of points at which this logic met both the body and the psyche of the contemporary individual in their everyday lives, in practices like health, housing, hygiene, etc. Open land, then, to stress implicitly question the relation between the state's more sort of benevolent role in ensuring the health and welfare of its citizens and the forms of control that it exerted over them in the name of maintaining productivity, or ultimately sort of profitability for the capitalist machinery. And I just want to say, of invoking Foucault, philosopher and historian, and his analysis of biopolitics, I'm not at all trying to suggest that open land communards were Foucauldian, that they were theorists or philosophers in the sense of Foucault's work. The commune members did write manifestos, they did rationalize their practice, demonstrated perhaps most prominently in the argument that they had a philosophy of architecture. We also see this in the long legal briefs that they used to battle the state's closing down of their spaces. Their arguments, though, appealed to insights emerging from what they saw as ongoing encounters in their own lived practice, or their sort of lived experience, or at least to the prospects of developing experimental testing grounds in order to be able to play out these ideals. Deeding the land to God, and as Gottlieb explained, was going to establish these sort of laboratories for testing the definition, defense, and demonstration of their alternative lifestyles. So we know Foucault was familiar with these alternative and communal lifestyles in Northern California. Foucault taught at Berkeley during this period, and we know he visited communes. But this is not so I'm pointing to a sort of historical coincidence, but Foucault worked in a radically different manner. His research was characterized by a very close-grained historical tracing and a sort of analysis of emergent forms of power and a theorization of what was at stake in this transformation. So Foucault famously theorized a transition from a sovereign to a disciplinary, and in turn to what he called a biopolitical paradigm, or really to a situation in which all these modes of power would operate simultaneously, that they would be sort of layered into contemporary forms of governance. But despite the very significant differences then in their conceptual tools, in their motivation, in their modes of practice, I want to suggest that the historical coincidence between the communards' struggles and Foucault's theorization is not entirely incidental or accidental. Both, in different ways, recognized something of the contemporary functioning of biopolitical forms of management and regulation. You know, Foucault had traced a history or genealogy. The open-led communes had tried to interrupt its functioning. And I want to come back very briefly in concluding to underscore what might be at stake in these struggles over open land for the discipline of architecture, for my field. Many of these communards believed that in working against the grain of the normative logics inscribed within conventional architecture and urban forms and instituted through planning and building codes, that these alternative structures themselves facilitated a mode of liberation from these forces. And I don't entirely believe this, and I just wanted to point to the fact that the sort of wooden aesthetic and even geodesic domes entered into normative or mainstream American culture as vacation houses without having anything like the political effect that they hoped. But it does seem that at the moment of the emergence of what I've been talking about, these practices had to stress identified points within the architectural process that architects took for granted, in which contemporary forms of governmentality impinge most directly upon the person, where techniques of power were most evident within the organization and regulation of the built environment. And it's perhaps in that register, rather than, say, in their register of their aesthetic value or in simple ideas about their liberatory function, that these sort of alternative built environments offer lessons for thinking about architecture, lessons regarding how buildings might serve, not simply to give a spatial form to dominant institutions or dominant normative modes of power. And this is, of course, the traditional role of architecture, to, in effect, give material form and a type of organizational logic to the dominant form of power, but how it might instead activate a type of tactical maneuver within or produce sort of sites of refusal of official forms of social and ideological regulation. So I'm asking whether architecture could articulate something like a type of counter-dispositif, a type of counter-occupation of the environment. And I don't have a clear answer to that, may indeed be beyond the task of architecture. So whether successful or not in contravening and transgressing normative modes of organization of the built environment to such a degree, these peculiar dwellings revealed domestic habitation to be a potential point of insecurity in the biopolitical apparatus. Who would have thought, as I mentioned before, that people, white middle-class people in America would choose not only to get rid of private property rights, but also to embrace this type of lifestyle. As was evident to government officials, these shelters spoke, in fact, to the idea that it was the system that was under attack, hence provoking these court injunctions, fines, and the extensive legal deliberations regarding their occupation of the land, and in turn producing legislation to forcibly govern their standards of living. So they actually tried to enact legislation that would prohibit communal dwellings. So far from facilitating anything like a statute-free sanctuary, open-land communes prompted local and state governing bodies to fight to preserve their integrity, or even to strengthen and expand legal statutes, including attempts, as I mentioned, to enact zoning amendment to refuse communal living. If the environmental aspects of these struggles over open land remain unrecoverable as viable practices, for all of the problematic aspects that I've tried to point to, and if the hippies' claims often remain shrouded in a problematic form of mysticism, as a historian, these lived practices nevertheless retain a remarkable value for helping to trace a type of historical experience and a mode of refusal of the functioning of regulatory and normative mechanisms of the state as they meet the built environment. These encounters, that is, they render visible operations of political power and control, while simultaneously revealing the complexities and limitations of attempting to simply withdraw from or overcome them. As the communards recognized, the county's response was motivated not by ensuring care of the land or of its inhabitants and of the environment as such, but was inseparable from the maintenance or even expansion of political power, a power absolutely invested in architecture. Thank you. So.